When a character dies in World of Warcraft, they will either respawn on a checkpoint, get resurrected, or have to ghost run to the place they died in order to come back to life. This resurrection system has been in the game ever since the original vanilla version, with only a few changes over the years. What many players don't know is that Blizzard once planned to add an entire zone exclusively for dead players, as well as NPCs that can only be seen and attacked by players in ghost form. Today we will take a closer look at some of the earliest resurrection systems and how some elements of these still somehow managed to make their way into the game. When World of Warcraft released in 2004, it was considered to be more forgiving compared to other MMOs, and this is because the penalty for dying was limited to the player losing some durability on their armor, as well as having to run as a ghost and find their body, which would then return back to life. Alternatively, they could choose to be resurrected at the graveyard, which would result in additional penalties. Compared to other games at the time, such as EverQuest, where players would lose experience and possibly even levels, or Ultima Online, where dead players might lose their equipment, the penalties for dying in World of Warcraft were fairly insignificant, and none of them had any permanent effect on the player character. But this wasn't always the case, as prior to WoW's official release, resurrecting did actually result in a loss of experience. This was eventually changed, but only on the very last patch before the game went live in late 2004, and in the original game manual, which had already been printed at this time, it's also stated that resurrecting at a spirit healer would make the player lose experience, even though this was no longer the case. Going back to the game's early development, the question of what should happen to a character once their health fell to zero still hadn't been solved, and in the first alpha versions, players respawned on special altars which could be found scattered around Azeroth, with Horde players resurrecting at an Altar of Storms, while Alliance players used the Altar of Kings. This respawn system had been taken from the Warcraft series, which World of Warcraft had initially been built upon, and when it was eventually removed, so were the associated altars, but a few of them did actually make it into the game once it released, and can still be found in the Burning Steppes and Blasted Lands to this day. Another system was the Bindstones that were to be located all around the game world, and players could then speak to certain NPCs who would bind them to a Bindstone, and this would then be the place where they respawned once they died, similar to saving in many other games. Development on this system was cancelled very early in the game's alpha version, but a small remnant of the Bindstones still exists in the game today, in the form of the Shaman spell called Astral Recall, which owes its existence to this system. And this is because during the same time, both the Mage and the Shaman class had the option to return to their Bindstone without dying by using the Shaman spell called Astral Recall or the Mage spell called Wolf Recall, which were essentially identical. In beta patch 1.6, Bindstones were replaced by the Inn system, which lets players choose an inn as their character's home that they can then return to by using the Hearthstone item. With this change, Astral Recall was remade to function like the Hearthstone, but on a separate cooldown, which was convenient because the Hearthstone had a long cooldown at this time. During the same patch, mages also lost the Wolf Recall spell, but instead they ended up getting the ability to teleport and create portals to the game's major cities. Going even further back, Blizzard envisioned a system where players who had died were to be sent to the Emerald Dream, which is a large unreleased zone that had been hidden away in the game files ever since the game's alpha version. The Emerald Dream was divided into 3 parts, which could be found in the corners of the zone. These were the Verdant Fields, the Emerald Forest, and an unnamed area where the top of a giant statue could be found. The zone was then supposed to be the place where players were sent once they died, and the idea was to populate the zone with characters from the Warcraft universe that had died before the time of World of Warcraft. The dead player character would then have the option to attack NPCs and take on quests that could only be completed within the Emerald Dream. The plans for this version of the Emerald Dream were cut early in the game's development, but at this time, Blizzard still hadn't given up on the idea of having special NPCs that players could only attack and interact with while in ghost form. But in the end, this wasn't really implemented. Although, as those who have played either the original vanilla or the classic 2019 version might remember that the questline for the Shadowforge key, which is started by an NPC named Franklin Forthright, requires the player to be dead, as the quest giver can only be seen by players in their ghost form. Another quest, called Meet at the Grave, which is part of the Lincoln questline from the Ungora zone, requires the player to drink a lethal poison at the graveyard of Gadgetson, which allows them to talk to the otherwise invisible Garion, who can be found near the mountainside separating Tanaris and the Thousand Needles. Blizzard eventually settled on the graveyard system that is still in use to this day, with very few changes over the almost 20 years since it was introduced. Some of the player base who enjoyed the high stakes found in older MMOs invented their own community-driven rule set, which limited various forms of grouping and trading, but most importantly required the player to delete their character in case they died. Over the years, and especially recently, this community challenge grew in popularity to a point where Blizzard decided to make their own official version known as Classic Hardcore Realms, which released in mid-2023. Unlike the community challenge, the Classic Hardcore version only has a single rule, being that players cannot resurrect in any way, meaning that death on these realms is permanent, although there have been some measures implemented to avoid dying due to bugs, as well as some special interactions allowing players to complete quests that would otherwise require them to be in ghost form. The Hardcore realms have attracted a lot of players who enjoy the slower game pace, where gold and powerful items are less abundant and often more appreciated, as well as the players who just want to set a challenge for themselves, whether it being the goal of reaching a certain level or grouping up and taking on some of the game's final bosses.